They told me I was too young and inexperienced to deserve a leadership position despite working 80-hour weeks and generating millions in revenue for the company. At 29 years old, I had spent 6 years climbing the corporate ladder at DataCore Solutions, only to watch less qualified people get promoted over me because I didn't fit their image of what an executive should look like. But what Vice President Katherine Walsh didn't know while she was blocking my promotions was that I had discovered her elaborate embezzlement scheme, and I was documenting every fraudulent transaction. Watch until the end because you won't believe how stealing evidence and perfect timing destroyed a career worth $2 million annually and gave me everything she tried to keep from me. My name is Sophia Martinez, and this is how I went from overlooked junior manager to vice president by exposing corruption that sent my former boss to federal prison. The corporate ladder struggle. DataCore Solutions was a software development company that had grown from startup to $800 million in annual revenue over 15 years, and I had been there since my first job out of college in 2017. I started as a junior project coordinator, making $45,000, and worked my way up through positions in operations, client services, and business development by consistently outperforming everyone around me. By 2023, I was a senior business development manager, earning $120,000 annually and managing relationships with our biggest clients who generated over $50 million in revenue. My performance reviews were always outstanding, and multiple clients had specifically requested to work with me because I understood their needs better than anyone else in the company. But every time a director or VP position opened up, I would apply and interview, and then watch as the job went to someone with less experience and worse results simply because they were older or male or had gone to more prestigious universities. The most frustrating part was that Katherine Walsh, who was VP of Business Development and my direct supervisor, would give me vague feedback about needing more experience and executive presence while promoting people who clearly didn't deserve the positions they received. The Katherine Walsh problem. Katherine Walsh was 52 years old, had an MBA from Wharton, and had been with DataCore Solutions for 12 years, rising from director to VP through a combination of political maneuvering and taking credit for other people's work. She was the kind of executive who was extremely skilled at managing upward to impress senior leadership, while treating everyone below her with contempt and creating a toxic environment where talented people burned out and quit. Katherine particularly seemed to resent me because my success with clients made her look bad by comparison, and because I refused to pretend she was brilliant when she was actually quite mediocre at understanding technology and client needs. She would regularly take credit for deals I had closed and strategies I had developed by presenting my work to the CEO and board as if it were her own brilliant thinking. When I tried to push back and claim credit for my own achievements, Katherine would accuse me of being difficult and not being a team player, and would threaten to damage my reputation with senior leadership if I didn't stop complaining. The power dynamic made it nearly impossible to challenge her without risking my entire career. So I learned to keep my head down and hoped that eventually my results would speak for themselves. The financial anomaly discovery. Everything changed 8 months ago when I was reviewing our department budget and expense reports as part of preparing a client proposal that needed detailed cost breakdowns. I noticed some unusual patterns in vendor payments that didn't match my understanding of our actual expenses and operational needs. There were recurring payments to a consulting firm called Strategic Solutions Group that I had never heard of, despite being intimately familiar with all our vendors and service providers. The payments were substantial, ranging from $15,000 to $45,000 monthly, and had been going on for over 3 years according to the historical records I could access. When I asked Katherine about Strategic Solutions Group during a routine meeting, she became immediately defensive and told me it was a specialized consulting firm that worked on confidential strategic projects for senior leadership, and that I didn't need to worry about it. Her reaction was so suspicious that I decided to investigate further using my access to financial systems and vendor databases that I had legitimate reasons to use for my client work. The embezzlement scheme uncovered. Over the next 6 weeks, I spent every spare moment investigating Strategic Solutions Group and tracing where the money was actually going. What I discovered was shocking. Strategic Solutions Group was a shell company that Katherine had created herself, and the hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees were actually being deposited into bank accounts she controlled. The scheme was sophisticated, but not sophisticated enough to hide from someone who understood how to trace financial transactions and who had legitimate access to the systems needed to investigate. Katherine had created fake contracts and invoices that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't examine them closely, and she had structured the payments to stay just below the thresholds that would trigger automatic audits or require additional approvals. Over 3 years, she had stolen approximately $2.4 million from DataCore Solutions through this fake vendor scheme, and she had been using the money to fund an extremely lavish lifestyle that should have been impossible on her VP salary. I found social media posts showing expensive vacations to Europe and Asia, receipts for luxury purchases that she had carelessly photographed, and property records showing she had bought a second home in Napa Valley that cost over $2 million. The documentation phase. Once I understood the scope of Katherine's embezzlement, I began systematically documenting everything I found, including detailed spreadsheets tracking every fraudulent payment, screenshots of fake invoices and contracts, evidence of the shell company ownership, photographs of Katherine's social media posts showing luxury spending that didn't match her salary, and timelines showing exactly when payments occurred and how they correlated with her expensive purchases. I was extremely careful to only access information through legitimate channels related to my actual job responsibilities, so that Katherine or anyone else couldn't later claim I had hacked systems or stolen data. I backed up everything to encrypted cloud storage accounts and USB drives that I kept in a safe deposit box, because I knew that if Katherine discovered what I had found, she would try to destroy evidence and probably have me fired or worse. The documentation process took 4 months because I wanted to be absolutely certain I had proof that would hold up to scrutiny from lawyers, auditors, and law enforcement. I also spent time researching whistleblower protections and consulting anonymously with employment attorneys to understand my rights and the best way to report corporate fraud without destroying my own career in the process.
The promotion betrayal. While I was secretly investigating Katherine's crimes, she was actively sabotaging my career in ways that made me even more determined to expose her corruption. A director of strategic partnerships position opened up that I was perfectly qualified for, and that would have been a natural progression in my career trajectory. I applied enthusiastically and prepared extensively for the interview process, believing that this time my track record and client relationships would finally be enough to earn a promotion. The interviews went extremely well, and several executives told me privately that I was the strongest candidate and that they were impressed by my vision for growing our strategic partnerships. But when the hiring decision was announced, the job went to Derek Johnson, a 38-year-old external candidate with far less experience, who had worked at a competitor that was actually struggling financially. I was devastated and went to Katherine to ask for feedback about what I could have done differently to be selected for the role. Katherine told me condescendingly that Derek had more executive presence and gravitas than I could offer at my current stage of development, and that I should focus on being grateful for the opportunities I already had, rather than constantly pushing for promotions I wasn't ready for. She said that young people today had unrealistic expectations about career advancement, and that I needed to be more patient and wait my turn like everyone else had done. The decision to act. Katherine's patronizing response to my disappointment about the failed promotion was the final straw that pushed me to act on the evidence I had been collecting. I realized that no matter how hard I worked or how good my results were, Katherine would always block my advancement because she saw me as a threat to her own position, and she enjoyed having power over people who were more talented than she was. I spent a weekend organizing my evidence and preparing detailed reports that explained exactly how Katherine's embezzlement scheme worked, how much money she had stolen, and how her fraud had gone undetected for so long. I created separate evidence packages for different audiences, including the board of directors, the CEO, the head of internal audit, external auditors, and federal law enforcement agencies that investigate corporate fraud.
Each package emphasized the information most relevant to that particular audience and included comprehensive documentation that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Katherine had been systematically stealing from the company. The Whistleblower Report. On Monday morning, I submitted a formal whistleblower report to our company's ethics hotline, which was managed by an independent third party to protect confidentiality and prevent retaliation. The report included a detailed summary of Katherine's embezzlement scheme, along with selected evidence that demonstrated I had legitimate concerns based on concrete financial data rather than personal grievances or speculation. I knew the ethics hotline would trigger an immediate investigation by internal audit and potentially by external authorities, depending on what they found. I also sent anonymous packages of evidence to the board chairman, the audit committee chair, and the SEC's whistleblower office to ensure that multiple parties would be investigating simultaneously and Katherine wouldn't be able to coordinate a cover-up. The timing was calculated to create maximum chaos because Katherine was scheduled to present our department's annual budget to the board the following week, and I wanted her to be dealing with fraud investigations while trying to maintain the appearance that everything was fine. The risk was enormous because if my whistleblower complaint was dismissed, or if Katherine somehow survived the investigation, she would certainly figure out I was responsible and would destroy my career permanently.
Within 48 hours of my whistleblower report, the company's internal audit team had begun a preliminary investigation into the Strategic Solutions Group payments and had discovered enough irregularities to elevate the matter to the board's audit committee. Katherine was told that her budget presentation was being postponed due to an ongoing financial review, but she wasn't initially informed that she was personally under investigation. I watched Katherine become increasingly nervous over the following days as auditors requested access to her files and emails and began interviewing people about vendor management and payment approval processes. She tried to maintain her normal, confident demeanor, but I could see the fear in her eyes during meetings when auditors' names were mentioned. Katherine called me into her office 3 days after I submitted the whistleblower report and asked whether I had noticed anything unusual about our department's vendor payments or whether anyone had asked me questions about Strategic Solutions Group. I lied smoothly and told her that everything seemed normal to me and that I hadn't been contacted by auditors about anything. Katherine seemed somewhat reassured, but I could tell she was desperately trying to figure out who had reported her and whether she could destroy evidence before investigators found everything. The suspension and chaos. 1 week after my whistleblower report, Katherine was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation and was escorted from the building by security with instructions not to contact any company employees or access any company systems. The official announcement said only that Katherine Walsh was on temporary leave due to an internal matter and that interim leadership arrangements would be announced shortly. The entire company was buzzing with speculation about what had happened because Katherine had seemed untouchable and her sudden removal suggested something seriously wrong. Several of Katherine's political allies and senior management were also quietly placed under investigation because auditors were trying to determine whether anyone else had been involved in the embezzlement scheme or had knowingly ignored red flags about the fraudulent payments. The CEO held an emergency all-hands meeting where he said the company was committed to the highest ethical standards and would cooperate fully with any investigations into potential misconduct. He didn't mention Katherine by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about, and the message was clear that the company was taking the situation extremely seriously. The interim leadership opportunity. 2 days after Katherine's suspension, the CEO called me into his office for a private meeting, and I was terrified that somehow he had figured out I was the whistleblower and was going to fire me. Instead, he told me that the board had been reviewing our department's performance and client relationships and had identified me as the person most responsible for our recent success. He said that while Katherine had taken credit for our achievements, it was clear to anyone paying attention that I had been doing the actual work of managing key clients and developing strategic partnerships. The CEO offered me the position of interim VP of Business Development with immediate responsibility for leading the department and managing the team through the current crisis. The role came with a salary of $250,000 plus performance bonuses and equity grants that could be worth millions if I successfully stabilized the department and maintained client relationships during the investigation.
I accepted the opportunity without hesitation, even though I knew some people would suspect I had something to do with Katherine's downfall. The CEO emphasized that the interim role was not permanent and that there would be a formal search process for the permanent VP position, but that I would be given serious consideration if I performed well during the transition period. The criminal investigation escalates. As I was taking over Katherine's responsibilities, the investigation into her embezzlement was expanding from an internal audit into a full criminal investigation involving the FBI and federal prosecutors. Forensic accountants had traced all the payments to Strategic Solutions Group and had confirmed that the company was a shell entity controlled by Katherine and that all the money had been deposited into her personal accounts. They had also discovered that Katherine had filed false tax returns by not reporting the stolen money as income, which added tax fraud to the list of federal crimes she had committed. The evidence was overwhelming and included everything I had documented, plus additional information that investigators had uncovered through subpoenas of bank records and interviews with financial institution employees. Katherine hired an expensive criminal defense attorney who tried to negotiate a plea agreement that would minimize her prison time, but federal prosecutors were not interested in being lenient because they wanted to send a message about corporate fraud and executive accountability. Media coverage began appearing about an unnamed executive at DataCore Solutions being investigated for embezzlement, and the story attracted significant attention because corporate fraud cases always generate public interest. The department transformation. While Katherine's legal problems were escalating, I was working 18-hour days to stabilize our department and prove I deserved the VP position permanently. I met with every major client personally to reassure them about continuity of service and to introduce myself as the new department leader. Several clients told me privately that they were relieved Katherine was gone because they had always preferred working with me anyway and had found Katherine difficult and out of touch with their actual needs. I restructured our team to eliminate the toxic management practices that Katherine had used to maintain control, and I promoted several talented people who had been held back by her favoritism and politics. I also implemented new financial controls and approval processes to prevent future fraud and to demonstrate to the board that I understood the importance of proper governance. The results were remarkable as our client satisfaction scores improved dramatically, our team's morale skyrocketed, and we closed several major deals that had been stalled under Katherine's poor leadership. Within 3 months, our department's revenue had increased by 22%, and we had the lowest employee turnover rate in the company's history. The permanent promotion. After 4 months as interim VP, the board conducted a formal search process for the permanent position that included external candidates and internal applicants. I went through multiple rounds of interviews and presentations where I had to prove I could lead at the executive level despite my relatively young age. Some board members expressed concerns about my lack of traditional executive experience, but others pointed out that I had already demonstrated excellent leadership during the crisis and that age was less important than actual results. The CEO strongly advocated for promoting me permanently and emphasized that bringing in an external candidate would be disruptive and would risk losing the momentum we had built. In October, the board voted to appoint me as permanent VP of Business Development, making me the youngest VP in company history and one of the few women in senior leadership. The announcement included glowing comments about my integrity, performance, and leadership during a difficult transition period. My salary increased to $300,000 plus significant equity and bonuses that could eventually make me a millionaire. I was overwhelmed with gratitude and determined to prove that the board's faith in me was justified. The trial and sentencing. Katherine Walsh's criminal trial took place 6 months after her arrest and lasted 3 weeks as prosecutors presented mountains of evidence documenting her embezzlement scheme. Katherine's defense attorney tried to argue that the payments to Strategic Solutions Group were legitimate consulting fees and that any irregularities were honest mistakes rather than intentional fraud. But this argument collapsed when prosecutors showed emails where Katherine discussed how to hide the payments and avoid detection. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours before convicting Katherine on all counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. At sentencing, the judge emphasized that executives who abuse positions of trust deserve serious punishment and sentenced Katherine to 11 years in federal prison plus full restitution of $2.4 million and 3 years supervised release after completing her sentence. Katherine's assets were seized to pay restitution, including her homes, cars, jewelry, and investment accounts, leaving her essentially bankrupt. Her professional reputation was destroyed, and she would never work in corporate America again after being convicted of such serious fraud. Several business publications wrote articles about Katherine's downfall as a cautionary tale about executive greed and the importance of financial controls. The company culture shift. Katherine's conviction and my promotion created a significant shift in DataCore Solutions company culture regarding how talent was evaluated and promoted. The board recognized that their previous approach of prioritizing credentials and traditional executive profiles over actual performance had allowed Katherine to rise to VP despite being mediocre at her job, while overlooking talented people like me who were producing superior results. The company implemented new leadership development programs focused on identifying and promoting high performers, regardless of age, background, or demographic characteristics. We also strengthened whistleblower protections and financial controls to prevent future fraud and to encourage employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. I became a visible advocate for merit-based promotions and for creating opportunities for talented people who didn't fit traditional executive stereotypes. Several junior employees told me privately that my story had inspired them to believe they could advance based on performance rather than just politics and connections. The personal vindication. The most satisfying aspect of Katherine's downfall was not the money or the title, but the personal vindication of knowing I had been right about her all along. For years, Katherine had made me doubt myself and wonder whether I was really as capable as I believed, or whether I was delusional about my own abilities. She had blocked my promotions while taking credit for my work and had made me feel like I would never succeed no matter how hard I tried. But by documenting her crimes and exposing her corruption, I had proven that Katherine's success was built on theft and fraud rather than legitimate achievement, and I had taken everything she tried to keep from me. The people who had been Katherine's political allies and who had benefited from her favoritism were now scrambling to distance themselves from her, and several lost their own positions due to questions about what they knew about her activities. Meanwhile, I was leading the department more successfully than Katherine ever had and was earning respect based on actual results rather than political manipulation and stolen credit. I occasionally wondered whether I should feel guilty about my role in Katherine's imprisonment, but then I remembered all the times she had humiliated me and blocked my career, and I felt absolutely zero regret. The ongoing success. 2 years after taking over as VP, my department has become the highest performing business unit in DataCore Solutions, with revenue growth of 45% and industry-leading client retention rates. I've been promoted again to Senior VP with expanded responsibilities including oversight of marketing and corporate strategy in addition to business development. My total compensation now exceeds $600,000 annually, plus equity that is worth several $1,000,000 and continues to grow as the company's valuation increases. I have hired and mentored dozens of talented people who had been overlooked by previous leadership and have created a culture where performance matters more than politics. Several of my former team members have been promoted to director and VP roles at DataCore Solutions and at other companies, and they credit me with giving them opportunities they never would have received under Katherine's toxic leadership. The company's board regularly cites our department as an example of how investing in talented people and holding leaders accountable for both results and integrity creates sustainable success. The lesson learned. My experience taught me that sometimes fighting back against corruption and injustice requires patience, careful documentation, and strategic timing rather than direct confrontation. Katherine Walsh had power and political protection that made her seem untouchable, but her arrogance made her sloppy about covering up her crimes, and her cruelty motivated me to invest months of effort into documenting evidence that would destroy her. If I had confronted Katherine directly about the embezzlement, she would have destroyed the evidence and had me fired. But by working quietly and systematically, I was able to build an overwhelming case that she couldn't defend against. The whistleblower approach also protected me from retaliation and actually positioned me as a hero who had saved the company millions of dollars, rather than as a troublemaker who had caused problems. Most importantly, I learned that the people who try hardest to keep you down are often the ones most vulnerable to being exposed, because their power is built on fraud and politics rather than legitimate achievement. Katherine spent years telling me I wasn't ready for leadership, but when she was removed, I proved I was more capable than she had ever been. Sometimes the best revenge is not just exposing someone's crimes, but taking everything they tried to keep from you and succeeding beyond what they ever achieved.